All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the online chapter treasurers class for the Southwestern District. Our presenter today for this treasurers class is John Santora. He's the current BHS Society Treasurer. John is a 41-year barbershopper and currently sings with the Alexandria Harmonizers in the Mid-Atlantic District, and is an assistant director of the Patapsco Valley chapter near Baltimore. He's a CPA and recently retired as the CFO of the Baltimore County Public Library System, one of the largest in the country. After 3 years as a BHS board member at large, during which he served as the chair of the Finance Committee, John was elected and continues to serve as the Society Treasurer, advising the board, CEO, and CFO on financial and governance issues. He also serves on the Joint Audit Committee of the BHS and the Harmony Foundation International. John, welcome. Thank you for presenting today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Scott, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. Appreciate the opportunity to work with the Southwestern District, even at a distance like this. It's always a pleasure to work with the incoming treasurers or people who've been in the role for quite a while and help them along in the function. What we're going to do is in the next 40 to 45 minutes or so, we'll cover the role of the chapter treasurer and the responsibilities, the timelines, the position itself, the resources you have available as a chapter treasurer. And then we'll look at some of the accounting and reporting basics and the regulatory requirements you'll need to deal with. We'll leave time at the end for questions, as Scott said. But if you have specific questions regarding something that's very state-specific, for example, we'll also give you some guidance on how to follow up with those. So, the role of the treasurer. Every chapter in the society is required to have a board of directors. There's 3 positions that are the minimum: the president, secretary, and treasurer. Many chapters decide to have more than that, of course. For very small chapters, the secretary and treasurer positions can even be combined if the chapter chooses. The treasurer and the secretary are full participating members of the board. So it's important that you don't be afraid to speak up at board meetings. That's really important and will help ensure that your chapter has a wide range of members and skills to address the chapter's operations and future direction. Even though you may be new to your position, you may be wondering, how long should a treasurer serve? That depends on you, your chapter, the availability of other proficient members willing to take on the task, and many other factors. Some chapter treasurers serve a few years and then move on. Others have served for decades. There's no right answer. Are you interested in moving on to another board or musical position after your term as treasurer? If so, you need to make that known to the president of the chapter, or he'll think you actually like being treasurer. As in most volunteer organizations, you may well have to search out and make your case to a few people to get them to understand that the treasurer's position isn't particularly onerous and that they shouldn't shy away from it if they're not trained accountants. In addition to attending board meetings, the treasurer provides valuable advice to the president and the board on the financial health of the chapter and the financial implications of decisions that the board may be able to make. Day to day, the treasurer pays the bills, reconciles accounts, and keeps the chapter in compliance with various regulatory requirements. We'll cover that in a little more detail just a bit later. Finally, the treasurer has a fiduciary duty to the chapter to act in the best interests of the chapter and its members, not for his own personal reward. The responsibilities of the treasurer can be grouped in these 3 areas. We'll cover each of them now in some detail. As I already mentioned, the treasurer is a full voting member of the board and should participate in all discussions and decisions, not just the financial matters. That's important, and to be able to do that, you need to attend all the board meetings. You should provide your regular reports to the board ahead of time. and use the time in the meeting to answer questions, not to present the report in detail. That helps to keep the overall time of the meeting manageable. IRS compliance is an important function of the treasurer, and it's more than just ensuring that the 990 is filed on time. There's a whole chapter devoted to this in the Chapter Treasurer's Manual, and that's available online if you don't already have it, the Society's website in the Documents Center. Please review the manual, and when it really does answer many questions about the role, duties, and responsibilities of the treasurer. The chapter secretary is usually responsible for maintaining the good standing of the chapter's incorporation with the appropriate state offices. But this varies by state. Some require an annual payment, or a list of current officers, or an acknowledgement that the corporation is still active. Some states don't require anything on an annual basis. You should check with the chapter secretary, and if he's unsure, check with the state to make sure your incorporation status is active and in good standing. Moving on to the financial aspects of the job, the primary duty of the treasurer is to keep accurate records. Without that, you really can't do anything else. It really is important to stay on top of things, to make detailed notes, keep all important documents, and update the financial records or a computer program if you're using that as often as possible. The treasurer has primary responsibility for assembling the budget. Yes, this says prepare the budget, but the treasurer rarely has all the expertise, plans, costs, priorities, and other information needed to accurately prepare a budget. That's why the section on budgeting in the Chapter Treasurer's Manual stresses the fact that the treasurer must get accurate information about the plans and ideas for the next year or longer from the people in charge of the various functional areas in the chapter: music, shows, uniforms, youth and harmony, outreach. Without that assistance, the treasurer is just guessing, and that's never a good thing. I'll talk more about budgeting later in this presentation. It's really important to pay bills promptly. If you've created a realistic budget, then this shouldn't be a problem. If your chapter has consistently overestimated revenue or underestimated expenses, this can be a big problem. Make sure your president knows and understands when you're having difficulty paying bills on time. It's not something to hide or be ashamed of, and you're only hurting yourself and your chapter if you try to ignore it or cover it up. Most vendors, auditoriums, sound engineers, uniform providers, people who sell things to your chapter, will work with you if you talk to them and let them know when they can expect payment. It's usually just a timing issue in many chapters. For example, when the next year's show ticket revenue will start and start to come in. So you should be able to work out a payment schedule with a couple of vendors if that cash flow issue presents a problem with your chapter. Preparing monthly reports of receipts and disbursements is important, and it's important for the person, not only for you and for the chapter board, for the person who will perform the chapter's annual financial review. However, I strongly suggest that you do not give your board of directors a monthly transaction list of all activity. It only opens the door for lengthy discussions about how much the phone bill is or what gas stations you use for the riser truck, rather than important policy issues that the board should be spending its time on. Again, this is something that we'll cover a little later on. Transaction lists are important, though, for your records and for the person doing your annual financial review. It makes it easier for them to see the scope of your activity and to choose specific transactions to select and look at the documentation you have on file for them, which is part of the process of an annual financial review. So just a quick note about the financial review. It's not an audit and doesn't have to be done by a CPA or financial professional. Look to the Chapter Treasurer's Manual in section 4.5 to understand what a financial review is, how it should be performed, and what the report should include. Moving on to the business responsibilities, it's in addition to the routine monthly bills, such as the director's fees, rehearsal hall rental, etc., you should also pay the balance of the society monthly billing for things like insurance, the 800 number support, music purchases, and other things that you are receiving from the society. If you see something questionable on the monthly invoice, then question it. Don't let it linger. It's easier to clear up a mistake or confusion when it's fresh in everyone's minds. This will only become more important as the society moves to automated deposits for dues revenue and charges to chapters' bank accounts for purchases in the near future. You should reconcile your checking account and any other accounts, such as investments, money market accounts, on a monthly basis, at the very least, as soon as possible after the end of the month. With online banking, statements should be available the next business day, so there's usually no need to wait for statements to come in the mail. With the use of bookkeeping software like Quicken, the reconciliation function is very simple and takes just a few minutes. Every year in January or February, the Society sends out information on the mandatory and optional insurance coverage available to chapters. The treasurer and president should agree on what additional coverage is needed, get the approval of the board, and apply for it. This is covered in detail in the material that the Society sends out, or it can be requested from the customer service team. While the chapter secretary is usually responsible for show clearance paperwork, there are fees involved that you will need to pay. Remember that your chapter is only responsible for ASCAP and BMI fees for shows that it directly produces. If you appear as a guest on someone else's show, it's that organization that's responsible for the clearance fees, not your chapter. Copyright clearance is also built into the cost of sheet music, but there could be additional costs, such as arranger fees for custom arrangements or mechanical licensing, which is a term that applies to making learning tracks or other recordings. Again, if in doubt, contact the customer service team on how to handle specific situations. Now, we're going to look at the specific months of the year and when things are required to take place throughout the term, yearly term as treasurer. It's really a good idea to start early and work with the outgoing treasurer, if you can, to finish up the year-end work and get a head start on the budget for the following year. That can be really helpful in the transition if you're a new treasurer coming in and understanding what the prior treasurer was working with, what his style of record keeping was, and allow you the opportunity to ask questions. One of the first orders of business as the calendar changes from December to January is to work with the secretary to obtain and file the necessary banking documents to change the signing authority from the previous treasurer to you. A few words about how many signatures you should have on a check. One is enough, really. It gives a false sense of security to require 2 signatures and usually becomes a burden and leads to delays in sending out checks when one of the signers isn't available. Chapter officers, including treasurers, are covered by bonding insurance up to $50,000, which is usually well in excess of the available cash in most chapters. You should make life easier on yourself and your president by insisting on only 1 signature. In December or January, you'll need to start your year by submitting the budget for board approval. We can't do more than hit the highlights of budgeting in such a short session, but we will do that a little later. But again, there is a very detailed chapter in the chapter treasurer's manual about budgeting and the best approaches to take with that. The longer you delay preparing and submitting your budget, the more the chapter will be flying blind and unnecessarily risking your chapter's financial well-being. Also, in January, you'll need to prepare and file any forms 1099 for director's compensation, say, or even a W-2 if you do have employees in your chapter, although that's very, very rare. There is guidance on the Society website that's updated annually about how to file 1099s and also how to file the 990N short form report to the IRS that most chapters are required to file. Finally, in January, you should begin to find the person, excuse me, who will perform the annual review for the previous year's activity in your chapter. Just a reminder that the financial review is not an audit, and it can be done by any chapter member who was not a board member during the year under review. It could be the former chapter, it could be a former chapter treasurer, although not your immediate predecessor. It could be a treasurer from a nearby chapter, or even a non-barbershopper who's a personal friend that owes you a favor. Ask your district treasurer if you have difficulty finding a person. He should be able to suggest a few names for you. And in every month, there are the mandatory things that always have to be done: paying bills, reconciling bank accounts, and preparing reports for the president and for the board of the chapter. At least every 3 months, you should review your actual receipts and disbursements against the budget if you're not doing this on a monthly basis with the reports to the board. You should be discussing any variances, significant variances, with the president and the board, and it will maintain an open line of communication so that there are no surprises when revenue doesn't meet expectations or expenses are higher than anticipated. May is a very important month in your chapter since it contains deadlines for reports to the society and to the IRS. Don't wait till the last minute, though. You'll have all the information needed by the middle of February or so. Too many chapters are not in compliance with the requirement to send in their financial review to the society. Your district president and treasurer will get a listing of outstanding chapters in your district, and you will be contacted if you're on that list. Filing this information with the society is a requirement to ensure overall compliance with IRS tax-exempt organization guidelines. You should also send in a copy of your financial statements and your 990 or the email receipt for your Form 990N. Again, this is something that the society does as part of its obligation of providing the group exemption for all of the chapters in the society, but it ultimately is the chapter's responsibility to file the documents with the IRS and to prepare the financial review and have it available for use by the society. The timing of things you'll need to do could be determined by circumstances unique to your chapter. When you have your annual show, for example, and members can also approach you at any time and ask questions like, can I deduct something on my personal tax return? You may not feel qualified to answer that, but there actually is a good resource for that in the Chapter Treasurer's Manual that goes into pretty good detail about the types of expenditures that society members incur that may or may not be deductible on their personal tax returns as a part of the charitable contribution section of deductions. So let's talk a little bit about the resources that you do have available in your role as treasurer. In addition to the Chapter Treasurer's Manual, there are many resources on the Society website in the Documents Center, and also from your peers in the district and other chapters. Some of these are the Business of Barbershop, which is a chapter business guide and gives an at-a-glance view of the calendar of the functions of the president, secretary, and treasurer throughout the course of the year. A guide for financial reviews, which is useful for both chapter and districts in terms of how the person preparing the financial review goes about that process and prepares their report. There's a chapter administrative leadership team overview handout, which is something that we usually give in the live sessions at leadership academies, that again goes into some of the questions and answers about the interaction between the president, secretary, and treasurer. There are slide decks of complete Leadership Academy Treasurer's Class presentations, which go into much more detail than we'll be able to cover today, since those sessions usually involve about 4 to 5 hours of class time and may give you some pointers about which direction to look into if you have specific questions in more detail. Also on the Society website are templates and sample reports for using Quicken and also for QuickBooks. QuickBooks is a little bit of overkill for most chapters. If you're familiar with that, it's used by many small and medium-sized businesses for their accounting and bookkeeping needs. But Quicken, the personal financial software, is actually surprisingly good for the vast majority of our chapters. And we do have a separate presentation on Quicken, but I'll cover a little bit of the highlights of using Quicken in just a few slides. And finally, on the IRS website, there are things like the frequently asked questions related to the IRS and tutorials on 1099 preparation and 990N filing. So there's a lot of information available in the Document Center to help you work through the role of the chapter treasurer. Let's move on to some of the accounting and reporting basics. The Society fiscal year is a calendar year, January to December. Since the Society provides the group IRS exemption for all chapters, it's required in the standard chapter bylaws that all chapters use that fiscal year, the calendar year. Most chapters use the cash basis of accounting. Some very large chapters might use the accrual basis, but that really isn't necessary for most chapters. If you need, for example, if you need to report on events that span multiple years, when show ticket sales start in October, say, but the show isn't until March, Quicken or other bookkeeping software can easily create reports that cover specific timeframes and only include specific accounts. So you can create a show report that only shows the activity and the revenue and expenses for your annual show and covers the time period that does not necessarily relate to the calendar year. It's very flexible in that way. The concept of restricted versus unrestricted funds, also known as social versus operating funds, is pretty complex, but it really is completely covered in the Chapter Treasurer's Manual. For our purposes here, suffice it to say that restricted funds come from the general public, and they must be used to further the musical mission of the chapter. Unrestricted funds come from the membership and can be used for almost any purpose except for expenditures that benefit only one member of the chapter, or for things that are completely outside the tax-exempt mission of the chapter. The Society provides a standard chapter chart of accounts for your use. You don't have to use it. There's a good discussion of it in the Treasurer's Manual, and you can make your decision about whether to use it, adapt it, or add to it, or use something else that you might find more appropriate. The Quicken and QuickBooks templates that are on the Society website use the standard chapter chart of accounts and also have some basic reports already created in the template. More about that in a few minutes. Now some comments about record keeping and documentation. You should always have documentation for all expenditures. But this doesn't necessarily mean a piece of paper for every payment you make. For example, if you have a contract with your director that requires a set amount every month, you don't need an invoice every month. Just keep the contract in your files. For revenue, I recommend that you get a receipt book from Staples or Office Depot and use it to record every incoming revenue item, whether it's cash or check, and for whatever purpose, to fully document the transaction. Even if the person giving you the money says, "I don't need a receipt," make one out anyway. It's your record of what happened, when it happened, and what it was for, which makes it easier to record it in your accounting system, sometimes many days later. And in the rare case when a dispute arises, you have the proof, whether it was or wasn't paid. As I mentioned earlier that you shouldn't provide transaction lists as part of your report to the board, the reason for that is that it gives the board the opportunity to dig down into the weeds about things that they're comfortable with, such as a telephone bill, and lets them sometimes avoid addressing the critical questions about why your annual show drew so few patrons. I recommend a simple balance sheet, which should be just the reconciled cash balance of your checking account, along with any other savings or investment accounts, and a simplified income statement with condensed categories of revenue and expenses. The income statement should fit on one page, 2 at the most. The information should be year-to-date actual. You really don't need the current month's information, but you can provide it. It's very easy to do one way or the other with the Quicken and QuickBooks software. You should provide the year-to-date budget and the variance from the budget. You should also have a separate page of narrative about the major variances. For example, if there's a timing difference due to when your show revenue is coming in compared to the expenses, and or if you have contest expenses that only occur at certain times of the year for coaching or travel. And if there are any unforeseen and unbudgeted items, such as a riser truck repair or even a large donation coming in. Again, the Quicken template provides these standard reports and makes it a lot easier. So we'll talk about Quicken in just a few minutes. The question often comes up, how long do I have to keep supporting documents in the chapter records? Here's the information, and this is actually provided in the Business of Barbershop guide that I mentioned earlier, and that's available on the Society website. You can see all that information. This is in the handouts, and it's also in that material, but it gives you a good sense of what you need to maintain on a 1, 3, 7 year basis, and some things you just actually have to keep forever. So let's talk a little bit about Quicken, or any accounting software for that matter. Quicken is easy to use. The interface mimics the handwritten check register that we are probably all familiar with from pre-electronic banking days. It's also inexpensive. At most, it's $50 a year, but you can continue to use an older version if you have it, 2017, or I still use Quicken 2010, and it's perfectly fine for the chapter purposes. And you can find these older versions on eBay, for example, for $20 or less sometimes. The main advantage of electronic bookkeeping is that it enforces accuracy in data entry. You really won't save any time entering data. It actually probably will take a bit longer than just writing down a note in the old-fashioned check register. But where it does save a lot of time is in the classification and reporting of results. Select a report, specify the time period, and you have it ready to print or save. And reports can be customized to cover specific projects, such as annual shows, as I mentioned earlier, even when they span multiple calendar years. Finally, Quicken allows you to create and enter budgets in a number of ways, as an annual amount spread equally over 12 months, quarterly, or even just a one-time entry in a specific month. That way, your budget can be customized to show a proper year-to-date budget and cash flow comparison to actual revenue and expenses, rather than just a simple 1/12 of the budget spread over every month. So here's just a quick visual of what the Quicken interface looks like. As I said, it pretty faithfully mimics the classic check register that we should all be familiar with. The reports, the balance sheet, and the income statement are all pretty straightforward and easily customized for your chapter's needs. Even though these reports probably have a little too much information compared to what I would recommend, you actually can condense these down into smaller categories, and there's a lot of flexibility in the reporting options that are available with the software programs. So just a quick reminder of the various benefits of using Quicken. Really, the bank reconciliation process is probably the best part about this. It really takes just a few minutes to compare the bank statement with the Quicken, resolve any differences, and print out a report that shows that everything is in balance. So let's move on to a little bit of time on budgeting. We can't cover budgeting completely today because it does involve a lot of things that are specific to your chapters. But please review the Chapter Treasurer's Manual. There's an entire section, Section 4, that discusses the preparation and use of a budget in detail. The key to a successful budget is timeliness and the availability of information and appropriate information on a timely basis. Ideally, you should start gathering information from the various leaders in your chapter well before the beginning of the budget year. Then, using the chapter's history as a guide, you can analyze their input for completeness and sensibility, and be ready to have a discussion with the chapter president about a draft budget. You, as a treasurer, shouldn't be making decisions about what is and isn't appropriate to include in the budget. That's a discussion with the president, and also if the board wants to make those decisions for the whole board. So it's just not the responsibility of the treasurer to decide on the priorities of the chapter. While your budget will generally just cover the upcoming year, you should consider longer range issues for example, when you compete in district or international contests occasionally, and the additional expenses that might entail for coaches and travel. Whether you'll be needing new uniforms in the near future or new risers, and whether you plan to do any fundraising or grant applications toward that. Whether the number or types of shows you plan to put on might change over the upcoming years. Those all have an impact on not only future budgets, but also have an impact on how much money you might want to start setting aside in your current budget to finance some of those activities, especially when they're major expenditures like risers or uniforms. So, in an ideal world, you'll have the budget approved by the board before the start of your fiscal year. And that usually doesn't happen in our small volunteer organizations, but try to get it approved in January at the latest. But remember, a budget is not cast in stone. It's a living document and needs to be monitored compared to actual revenue and expenses, and modified if necessary when circumstances warrant. That's why I recommend that your monthly reports include a comparison to the budget. You don't have to change the budget for every little discrepancy, but if your show revenue is only 60% of your plan, something has to give, unless you were already forecasting a huge surplus for the year. The treasurer and the president should closely monitor the actual versus budget throughout the year and should be ready to bring any budget modifications to the board on a timely basis when called for during the year. While it's cumbersome to prepare detailed what-if scenarios in addition to your formal budget, you and the president should have a worst-case scenario in mind. What expenses could be delayed or trimmed? Do you need to buy new music as quickly or as often as the music leadership has indicated? Do you bring in coaches more than you can afford, or the timing of going out and getting new uniforms, for example? So all of those things could be considered and just have in the back of your mind as to what if the show revenue is a disaster this year. And it's really helpful to have that as a starting point for discussion rather than having to scramble at the last minute before a board meeting to discuss those situations. The other aspect about this is how can you maximize your revenue? I mean, are you doing all you can to raise money for your chapter? Are you pursuing grant applications? Do you have any kind of fundraising component in your chapter? These kinds of things are often overlooked by many chapters, but could make a significant dent in your ongoing needs as a chapter. So let's look at the regulatory requirements and the compliance issues that you'll need to work on fairly continuously along with the chapter secretary in many cases. IRS compliance is a big part of the treasurer's job. Filing all the required forms, 1099s, and the appropriate version of the annual 990, even a W-2, as I said, if you do have employees, which many chapters don't. But filing those forms is critical to maintaining your chapter's good standing as a 501c3 organization with the IRS. If that status is revoked, and that usually occurs for failure to file a 990 for 3 consecutive years, it is a very time-consuming and expensive process to get it reinstated. And the impact is entirely on your chapter, not on the society or your district, although both of them can provide assistance to try to get your status reinstated. If for some reason you aren't able to get it reinstated, your chapter could become liable for federal and state income taxes on any potential net income in years when your status is revoked. So it really is important for the sake of your chapter's good standing to make sure that you're always in full compliance with IRS deadlines and filing requirements. Maintaining your corporate status is usually the responsibility of the chapter secretary, but as I said earlier, some states require an annual payment. Others just require a current list of officers and directors, and some states don't require anything on an ongoing basis. Check with your chapter secretary, and again, if he's not sure, make sure someone follows up with your state to determine the actual requirements. Losing your corporate status opens the directors and members of a chapter to potential legal liability that the corporate status protects. Finally, although your chapter may file the appropriate 990, obtain an annual financial review, and maintain its corporate status, your chapter needs to report these to the society on the society's website. There is guidance on the website on how to do this, and every chapter's president, secretary, and treasurer are authorized to make these entries in the member center under the compliance filings and reports section. Again, the requirement for this is part of the society's due diligence in making sure that all the chapters that exist under the group exemption umbrella are doing are informed of what their obligations are, and the society is maintaining its documentation of their efforts to maintain their good standing under that group exemption. So it really is an important part. Just filing with the IRS is not the end. You have to go on the society website and also indicate that you've done these steps in the compliance filings and reports section. Let's talk about fundraising for a little bit. Since many chapters engage in fundraising, but many are not aware of the proper methods or even potential risks. If your chapter is applying for a grant, you must read the grant document, application document and requirements, and meet those to a T. The only requirement that may routinely be waived in a grant application is for an audit. And that must be requested in advance before you submit the application. You should cite the size of your chapter, the prohibitive cost of a true audit, and the fact that you have an annual review of the chapter's finances by a disinterested person. This waiver will usually be granted for small organizations and may be as simple as a phone call to the granting organization. If you do request a waiver by phone, make sure you document it and refer to it in the cover letter with your grant application. For all grant applications, make sure your project fulfills the mission of the donor, not just your chapter. Try to word your application in such a way as to highlight the alignment of the donor's mission with the specific funding request that you are making. You'll have a much higher probability of success in that scenario. Does your chapter solicit donations from the public? For example, do you put a donate here button on your website or include a donation form in your annual show program? Well, that is solicitation. And many states have registration requirements for solicitation, including annual fees, tracking ability, and reporting requirements to the state and or the public. If your state has such requirements, it may not be beneficial to solicit donations unless your expected receipts greatly exceed the cost and effort of compliance. Be aware that any donation for which the donor expects to deduct a charitable contribution on his or her personal tax return must be treated as restricted funds by the chapter. So, a question that often comes up is the Harmony Foundation donor choice check that may come in twice a year to your chapter restricted or unrestricted? You may think it's unrestricted since it ultimately came from your members, but your member likely took a tax deduction or was eligible to take a tax deduction for his overall gift to the foundation. So it really is restricted. Of course, this also applies when a member of your chapter wants to make a donation directly to the chapter for which he wants to take a tax deduction. Again, there's pretty specific guidance in the Chapter Treasurer's Manual on many of these scenarios. There's also guidance, as I started to mention before, about the kinds of activities that a member may or may not consider as tax deductible over the course of a year. For example, dues and travel to and from weekly rehearsals are not deductible, but travel to contests and shows can be deductible. Your members will look to you as the in-house expert on these matters. So at least familiarize yourself with the information that's in the Society Chapter Treasurer's Manual and let them know that you have some resources on that, even if you're not able to answer their question right at that particular moment. Well, that's it for the formal part of our presentation. I know that for some, we've just covered the basics, and for others, this was actually pretty basic if you've been a treasurer for quite some time. But I hope it's answered at least some of your questions, and I'll turn it back to Scott now, and we'll take some of the questions that you've already posted in the remaining time today, and I'll just take this opportunity to wish you all good luck in your term as chapter treasurer.
Thank you, John. Yeah, I do have a couple of questions for you. First of all, you mentioned in the records retention section, when you covered that, you didn't go into detail on everything there, but there was one thing that I saw in there that was noted where it says that we should retain membership applications for 3 years. Now, with the new member center, we have the ability to apply, or members can apply online rather than having to do the paper form that we traditionally did and maintain copies of. If they apply online, how do we retain those copies? I mean, do we have to go back to the customer service department and request copies of those so that we can retain them for 3 years, or how should we approach that?
That's a requirement that was put in the chapter treasurer's manual long before the online requirements. So if you're doing a totally online application, then I'm not sure. I haven't done an online application, so I don't know if there's a print the application before you submit it, or the ability to go back and do it. It's not a bad idea to keep it, even if it's done online, but I don't think it's as critical as it is if somebody comes back a year or so later and say, I never get anything from society. What address do you have on file? And you can point to the fact that he wrote his address down incorrectly or whatever. It's really not a critical requirement. It's one of those things that just you want to make sure that everything is available to double check information that will gradually roll in over the course of a couple of years. New member will then have a dues renewal, a first-time dues renewal that may not go to the right address, or the email address is wrong, or whatever. So you want to have some kind of track record of what was given initially, and if there was a mistake made at some point along the line, who made it, and how do we correct it?
It would probably be a good idea for chapter secretaries, like quarterly or semi-annually, to at least go into Member Center and take a look at all of the the information there, and just double check with their own records to make sure that those are all accurate, just to eliminate any potential problems like that. But it's a valid point, just to keep them in case we ever do need to go back and dive into them again. Another question that came up is are there any reports, like audits, for instance, that the BHS may request other than the normal filings associated with the 990N and the annual review?
Not necessarily the society requesting. I think the only time you get into a situation where there may be an unusual request or report is if there is some kind of malfeasance that happens. If a chapter treasurer or someone else who has access to the funds of the chapter misuses the funds or absconds with them, there may be a need. And again, this is not necessarily the society. The society can provide assistance in terms of helping the chapter understand what happened and what legal steps could be taken to recover money. But it's more the availability of a process and some information that could be available to the chapter to help them through those difficult times. But on an ongoing basis, no. The requirement for providing the 990 information and financial review and maintaining the corporate status are the three pieces of information that's needs to be reported to the society.
Okay. I've only got one more question that's been queued up, so if anyone who is online live in the presentation right now has another question that we haven't covered yet, feel free to enter that into the chat function down at the bottom of your screen, and we'll see if we can address it in the few minutes that we have left. One question that came up for me, and I pulled up the copy of the BHS Chapter Treasurer's Manual, which I'll be sending out to everyone who's attending the class as soon as we finish. I just wanted to touch for a second on the difference between the unrestricted and the restricted funds that you mentioned, that you brought up earlier, because I want to make sure that I fully understand it. So, for instance, if someone makes a donation to a specific project, for instance, let's say that we had we wanted to raise money for risers, to buy a new set of risers, and we had a fundraising for that specifically. When they talk about the restricted versus the unrestricted, that's really what we're referring to, is that money has to be used for that specific purpose and that one only. Am I understanding it correctly, or are there other aspects to that we need to be aware of? Because you mentioned the aspect of them, whether they can deduct it on their income taxes. I was just hoping for a little general clarification. I know the details are in the manual.
Yeah, there are two types of restrictions.
Okay.
There's an overall restriction which applies to any funds that are given to the chapter from the general public, or even from a member who wants to take a tax deduction. The restriction is that the funds have to be used for the mission of the chapter, which is education, providing performances, the general musical mission of the chapter. But that could be anything. It could be buying music. It could be paying the director's stipend. It could be the auditorium rental. It could be show expenses. It could be many, many things in the chapter's operations. The other type of restriction is the one that you mentioned, where a donor will give you money for a specific purpose. And that is more along the lines of what in the fundraising world is called a donor restriction, where they give you money, but you have to use it for one specific purpose. In your case, purchasing new risers. And then you usually should, sometimes are required, but you usually should report back to that donor within a reasonable time and say that, yes, thank you for your funds, and yes, here is what we purchased with it, here's the overall cost, and here's what you contributed to it, thank you very much.
Okay, so I see mentioned in the manual that it just makes a mention of something, because it's talking about, you mentioned like restricted funds can be used for the operating fund, but then it makes mention of money used in a non-restricted sense, i.e. for social funds. Is it saying there that in some cases you may have a budget where someone might give you some unrestricted money, or you might receive some unrestricted income? The social funds is what I'm questioning, as opposed to the operating fund. Is that like, we want to throw a year-end party and use part of the money for that? Is that what that really refers to, or can you expound upon that?
Absolutely. That's the money that comes in from the chapter members themselves for dues, or for if you're having a cast party and you have each person pay a certain amount of money for the cast party, that money can be used for things that are not necessarily strictly related to the mission of the chapter. Then they could benefit the membership as a whole, but you still can't use any of the chapter funds, whether they're restricted or unrestricted, that to benefit a single person in the chapter. I mean, the question often comes up, a person's house burns down, and the chapter wants to have a show, and the proceeds from the show can be used for that person to help them recover from that. Can't do it. It's totally outside the mission of the chapter, and even though the fund, a part of it is the fact that the funds come from the general public, presumably, but even if you just pass the hat among your members, as soon as the funds go through the chapter's books, they become part of they become restricted by the IRS regulations around nonprofit organizations. And one of those restrictions is that you can't use chapter funds for the benefit of a single person. And that, again, is something that we have a lot of questions about over time. And the single person versus a class of people is an important distinction to remember. And let me just take a minute to explain that. For example, a chapter often will say, well, we have a couple of students in our chapter that are really good singers, and we'd like them to go to international with us. But they don't have any money. They're going to college and they're in debt and all this kind of stuff. Can we pay their way to international? The answer is maybe. Because if you offer that benefit to every person who is a student, who has been a member no longer than 2 years, 3 years, whatever number you happen to pick, and is competing in the international chorus, then you've created a class of membership. There may only be one person in that class this year, but it's still a class of membership that you're offering a benefit to. And it really is an important distinction, and one that's quite frequently used by a lot of our chapters. But again, it still has to relate to the mission of the chapter. Going to international is related to the mission of the chapter. And it can't be for the benefit of one single person. You can't offer it to one student and exclude another student.
Got it. Okay, so there's a lot of detail in the treasurer's manual, and I assume that if a chapter treasurer, after reading that section, still has questions, how would they best ask those questions, or to whom should they address them in Nashville?
Well, depending on the question, most times a call to the customer service team is a good starting point. If it's a question that doesn't arise often and they don't have an easy answer for, they'll take your information and they'll get it to someone who can answer it, and that person will get back to you.
Okay, that's good to know. A follow-up question from Joe online. He asks, can chapter money be used to reimburse travel expenses to do a paid sing out at distant locations?
Yes, they can. Yep.
Okay, so that's covered under the operating fund restriction.
Yes, because again, that performance is a part of the mission of the chapter. So if people are incurring expenses, then they can be reimbursed. If the chapter has the ability to do that, they can be reimbursed for it.
Excellent. Okay, John asks, and this is a different topic, but he asks, can you review expenses that must be reported on the 1099 for guest, quartet, and choruses versus expenses that do not apply, such as travel, meals, and hotel expenses? He says, I've always read this to be just the performance fee, but he'd like the confirmation.
Yes, it is just the performance fee. Any expenses that you provide, well, I shouldn't say that. There are always exceptions. If the performance fee is definitely something that needs to be on the 1099. As far as expenses go, if you reimburse them for expenses that they actually incur, then it doesn't go on the 1099. If you only provide them an allowance for expenses, then yes, it does need to go on the 1099, because then you're only estimating what the expenses are going to cost, and you may give them an estimate based on 2 people in a hotel room, and they may cram all 4 into one hotel room and save money. So it's something that if you're reimbursing for actual expenses incurred, the IRS accepts that and says, okay, you don't need to report it as income. If you're only providing an allowance, the IRS thinks that there's a possibility here that what you provide them is going to be more than what they actually incur. So then it becomes that person's or the quartet's responsibility to record the income based on the 1099, including the allowance, and then show the expenses that they actually incurred on their Schedule C or whatever partnership form or whatever form of organization that quartet happens to be. So in most cases, I recommend reimburse. Don't give them an allowance. It's a little more cumbersome because they have to send you receipts and things like that, but it keeps it off the 1099.
Yeah, I know that in some cases in the past we've had quartets that have just expected their performance fee and then they had a per diem, and I think they probably just did that to make it simple. But I think you're right. It for this purpose would make it a lot easier to have them just record their expenses and then just reimburse directly for them, as you said.
Yeah, and per diem is at least for meals. A per diem is kind of a gray area in terms of whether it needs to be included on the 1099 or not. IRS recognizes that people have to eat, and the per diems are generally not ridiculously high. You know, if you give somebody a $50 a day per diem to cover food expenses, you know, they may spend 35 or 40, or they may spend 60 or 70, but it's all going to wash out in the end, and at least as far as the IRS is concerned. So there's on a per diem for meals, I wouldn't be too concerned about showing that on the 1099. But if you're only giving them an allowance, an overall allowance for travel, hotel, airport transfers, and meals, then that does need to be included on the 1099. The other thing that quartets often request, which I don't think the question includes this, but many times a quartet will say, well, our fee is $2,300, but can you make out a check to each individual person for $550 or whatever the magic number is to keep it under 600? And the answer to that is no. The thing is, you should write your contract with the quartet in such a way that it says you will pay them with one check in the quartet's name, and the quartet needs to give you a federal ID number, whether it's one of the members' social security numbers or a tax information number that they have as a partnership or just for Schedule C purposes. If they don't give you a federal ID number in the contract, then your chapter could be liable for income tax. You should, if you don't have an ID number, you should withhold 30% of the payment and remit it to the IRS for federal income tax, because there's an expectation in the IRS that if someone doesn't provide you with a tax identification number and receives a payment from you, they are not going to report that on their income.
So is that covered in the chapter treasurer manual, John? Because that's an important distinction, because I know in the past we've had quartets come in where they've requested to be paid individually, but it sounds as if you're saying that they should pick one member to be the receiver of those funds, and that member should submit either a federal tax ID number or a social security number, and then they're responsible for any filings and withholdings on their end.
Yeah, and that's exactly what should happen. The Treasurer's Manual has been revised, and I'm not sure if I didn't do the revision. And you're catching me a bit off guard here about the level of detail that's in there about that. If it's not in there, it probably should be. because it is something that comes up. I mean, the big quartets know this, and they have their organizational structure built around the fact that they're doing shows and frequently, and this always comes up, and they account for it properly. It's the smaller quartets, the district champions, who are just getting to the level of charging that much for a performance that usually run into issues with this.
Okay, that's a valid point. And again, if we have questions on that or ironing that out, with something we can certainly address with customer service, and they can point us in the right direction if we need assistance.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's all the questions that we have. We're going to go on ahead and wrap this up. John, I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much. This has been extremely informative, and some of the feedback I've gotten from people is that it's been a great refresher. So for those of you who attended this morning, this will be recorded and placed onto YouTube so that you can view it at a later time if there's anything that you missed. Or if you have questions, you can always email me at dir-lt, that's for Director of Leadership Training, dir-lt@swd.org. John, thank you again. We really appreciate it, and y'all have a great day.
Thank you.